To say life in England in the 1200s was a struggle for most is a bit of an understatement. Many lived just above starvation level, needing just one bad harvest to bring misery and death to countless families. Most were legally tied to the land where they worked, and couldn't leave to find better living conditions, not that they were ever really there to be found, even if they wanted to. Free men had a slightly better lot in life. They could leave if times got hard, but travel was dangerous, with a crime rate far higher than it is today. It was a land of inequality. If arrested, a layman could expect a stint in the brutal world of a medieval prison. Then, if found guilty, likely death, with what little he did have seized by the king, leaving his family destitute. But a member of the clergy, arrested for the same crime, would be handed over to the church to administer punishment. Sometimes they would be whipped, but other times punishment was as simple as restricting them to bread and water for a period of time. And this was something that happened time and time again, and it was not easily forgotten. This grew resentment between locals and churchmen all over the country, and Norwich was going to be no exception. This, piled upon many other things, would lead to an explosion of violence in 1272 that would see damage done to Norwich Cathedral that would take over a century to fix. The whole city cast out by the Pope and the King, and a monument to the city's penance and shame that still exists to this day. By 1272, the relationship between the people of Norwich and the monks of Norwich Cathedral, who by this time were under the watchful eye of Bishop Roger Scaring, or sometimes Skirning, were already at rock bottom. Arguments had long raged over rights, boundaries and duties, both sides regularly flouting their responsibilities. But for the locals there was nowhere to turn for recompense. The courts would not intervene, as the monks did not need to follow the city's laws. Bishop Roger just seemed to be a fairly decent bishop when it came to his attitude towards his monks anyway, being described as loving his monks of Norwich with great affection. He also knew, or at least thought he knew, how Norwich was, having been both a prior and a monk there. But it seemed possibly all this had done was blinded him to just how bad things were really getting, and it was a situation he was now directly contributing to. The catalyst to his latest insult to the people of Norwich was a storm that had come through earlier in the year. It had damaged the cathedral spire and the roof of the church of St Ethelbert that stood in the cathedral grounds. Sadly, it's a church we know virtually nothing about today, but it's believed to have stood on that site since before the cathedral itself was built, and had survived the plunder of Norwich in 1217 by Prince Louis of France. But now its days were running out. The storm had made St Ethelbert's unusable. So Bishop Roger devised a very unpopular plan that involved moving multiple congregations, swapping churches all over the city to make room for those from Ethelbert's. But he was also using it as a backdoor way to get the men he wanted in charge of certain churches and extend his reach of power. For instance, the parishioners of St Helen were to be transferred to the Church of St Giles, and St Helen was to be handed over to the monks and the clergy for their own uses. As well as this, the church was to take personal ownership, everything St Helens contained. And it was these layers of overstep upon overstep that slowly started to grow a deep-seated hatred between the church and the people of the city. The riot itself would take place at the height of summer, as so many of them seemed to do. By this time, many of the locals had started a sort of tit-for-tat campaign against the monks, pushing their luck wherever they could to annoy them, and the monks were more than happy to return the favour. Things came to a head during the Norwich Horse Fair and Market, at this time being held just outside the cathedral grounds in Tombland. Those who were attending it were already put off over a toll they had to pay to the monks to be able to go to it. So, you can imagine their reaction when they saw a group of monks, along with other cathedral members, coming in to order them to take down a target that was being used for lance practice, as they found where it had been constructed very annoying to them. No doubt the beer had been flowing fairly liberally, and harsh words soon broke out into a fight between the people using the market and representatives of the cathedral. In the ensuing melee, at least one citizen was killed. The monks retreated to their sanctuary, and, as they had done time and time again, the locals turned to the courts, hoping they would find some way to sort out these overbearing churchmen. and it seemed that this time even the courts had had enough of the attitude of Bishop Rogers and his followers, issuing warrants for the priory men involved in the fight, saying they were to be captured wherever they be found. This provided all the justification the exasperated peasantry needed to hear. A large crowd gathered, armed themselves, and marched on Tombland and the cathedral. Monks closed the gates and instructed the guards to keep the crowd out no matter what, even sending word to Great Yarmouth, summoning a group of hired mercenaries they had contact with to come and help them. For lack of a better word, Norwich Cathedral was now under siege, and would remain so for around 3 weeks. The gates closed, its guards and mercenaries on high alert, and its monks no doubt frantic, wondering what was going to happen. And its bishop? Well, he was taking part in his own private siege, locking himself away in his private quarters, and refusing to come out to try and calm the situation. And it was a situation that was about to get far, far worse. It's unknown if the following actions of the mercenaries were ordered from inside the cathedral, or they were simply bored soldiers of fortune. But every now and then they would fire crossbow bolts at passers-by, and, on 2 separate occasions, ventured out into Tombland to raid taverns and nearby homes. During one of these, at least 1 man was killed and several others hurt, as they looted, robbed and burnt whatever they wished. This was the final insult that many were willing to take, and the next morning, either the 8th or 9th of August 1272, historians are undecided, a large crowd gathered in Tombland and once again marched to take their revenge on the monks. The monks had hoped the obstacle of a closed and locked gate and the armed men would simply disperse the crowd. But any hope of this was soon shattered, when guards climbed the nearby wooden belfry that was located next to the gates, and opened fire on the crowd with crossbow bolts when they wouldn't leave. This enraged the people and they began to try and force their way through the gates. When this didn't work, the gates themselves were set ablaze. While some burnt and tried to push their way through, others, armed with longbows, climbed the tower of the nearby St. George and returned fire on the mercenaries on the walls. Just on a side note, I think it's important to point out this is not the current St. George that stands on the site, but an earlier church that occupied the same space, but now no trace of it remains. When the gate finally fell, the mob stormed into the grounds of the cathedral and into the church of St. Ethelbert, looting and then setting it ablaze. They also set fire to the belfry they had been fired on from. Next to go was the Norman monastic buildings, the wooden cloisters of the cathedral itself, and the priory. Their sanctuary stormed and burning, the monks fled for their lives, many heading for Great Yarmouth, but others were not so lucky. Those caught by the mob were killed on the spot. The chaos around the cathedral lasted for 3 days, and it has been described as one of the most violent attacks on a religious house to occur in medieval England. It saw extensive damage done to many buildings, including the cathedral itself. Its original cloisters were almost completely destroyed, and marks from the fire remain visible on the stonework in certain places. Books, gold, silver, paintings and other valuables were either looted or destroyed, and on top of this, 13 people lay dead. The main body of the riot was now over, but the violence would carry on for some time after it. Upon his escape to Great Yarmouth, the prior, William de Burnham, sent back another group of mercenaries, who roamed the cathedral's surrounding areas, leading to several small clashes, in which Prior Burnham even personally killed a local the day after the riot, all while the city's authorities tried and failed to calm both sides down. It would take the involvement of King Henry III, by then in the final weeks of his life, and the future Edward I to put a final end to the fighting, as they came to the city on the 14th of September to personally overwatch the 13-day trial and see justice done. 30 citizens, among them several members of the local government, believed to be leaders of the riot, were found guilty and put to death. Some were hanged, while others were tied behind horses and pulled through the city streets until death, a truly horrible way to go. In the following months, William de Burnham was also arrested for his actions, but, as per normal, he was handed over to the bishop to pass sentence and was only given a minor punishment. Rather shockingly and strangely, as part of the punishment, the whole city was excommunicated, and would remain so until 1275, when the city finally agreed to raise the funds of 3,000 marks, at the rate of 500 a year, to build a new gate to replace the one that had been destroyed in the riot, to show their penance. It was built near the site of what had been St Ethelbert's Church, and so it gained the name St Ethelbert's Gate, and would take 50 years to build. They were also to give the church a cup worth £100 in gold, which would be used as a sacrament in the high altar in the cathedral, and at their own expense they were to send a representative of the city to Rome, to tell Pope Gregory X what had happened, and to beg his pardon on the people of the city. The damage done to the cathedral would not be easily repaired. St Ethelbert's and the detached belfry they set fire to would never be rebuilt. Work to replace the Norman cloisters would not begin until 1297, and wouldn't end until 1450, although it has been argued that some of the damage reported may have been over-exaggerated by the monks in order to get more sympathy from the king, and that some of the fire damage was probably caused earlier by blacksmiths employed by the cathedral rather than during the riot. Nothing remains of the church of St Ethelbert's now, but it is thought to have stood on what is now Almery Green within the cathedral grounds. The gate that bears its name, though, is still very much visible, now acting as the vehicle entrance to the cathedral. And although not open to the public as it's now a classroom, above the gate was once the chapel of St Ethelbert as well. That day in August would not be the first or last time violence had sprung up in the city due to tension between religious groups, nor would it clear the air between the people and the cathedral, as the much-hated tolls would carry on until the 16th century. Today, though, the relationship between Norwich and its cathedral could not be better. It's a great place many choose to visit. You can join one of their guided tours or simply wander around by yourself. And of course, there is always the option of simply sitting in its grounds and enjoying the sun in the summer. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the Norwich Cathedral riot of 1272, and this was a little bit of history.